The heavy silver collar bit so deeply into Lyra's throat that swallowing felt like choking on shattered glass, but she refused to give her traitorous pack the satisfaction of a scream. Her former alpha, Thorn, stood in the front row of the underground subterranean auction house, his hand resting possessively on the waist of Lyra's own sister, the woman he had elevated to Luna after stripping Lyra of her birthright. Tonight, the Blood Moon Pack wasn't just discarding their rightful heir. They were selling her to the worst scum of the shifter underworld as bruised, impure meat. The air in the cavernous auction hall was thick and suffocating, reeking of stale sweat, cheap cigar smoke, and the sharp, rotting metallic tang of fear. Lyra knelt on the rough wooden planks of the auction block. Her hands were chained brutally behind her back, the double-forged silver cuffs locking her wrists together at an awkward, agonizing angle. She couldn't use her hands to balance. When the auctioneer's burly assistant had shoved her onto the stage moments ago, Lyra had deliberately twisted her body mid-fall, taking the bruising impact entirely on her left shoulder and collarbone. It was a calculated sacrifice. She had to protect her lower abdomen at all costs. 4 weeks, she thought, her sharp, analytical mind cutting through the haze of agony. I am 4 weeks along. Her wolf was entirely suppressed by the silver seeping into her bloodstream. The agonizing lethargy of silver poisoning was already setting in. Her veins burned with a dull, constant fire, and she knew the biological clock was ticking. Without alkaline soil or crushed moonflower root to neutralize the heavy metal toxicity, she had roughly 48 hours before her kidneys began to fail. She couldn't fight her way out, not like this. So, she observed, she planned. Lyra's ice-blue eyes scanned the dimly lit room through a curtain of unkempt raven hair. 3 exits. The heavy iron door to the north was blocked by 2 brute-class mercenaries. The eastern hallway was a bottleneck. The western loading dock, however, was only guarded by 1 bored sentry rolling a coin across his knuckles. If the buyer transports me via a wooden carriage, I can use my bound legs to kick out the rotted floorboards during transit. If it's a steel transport cage, I feign unconsciousness until they unlock the door to feed me, then go for the handler's throat with my teeth. She was an Omega by forced demotion, but she had the tactical intellect of an Alpha's daughter. She was not a victim waiting to die. Lot number 42! Silas, the greasy, rat-faced auctioneer, bellowed, striking his gavel. He sneered down at Lyra, kicking her hip with the toe of his boot. Lyra didn't flinch, her jaw locking tight. A fallen prize from the Blood Moon Pack, stripped of her rank. As you can smell, gentlemen, she's already been scented by a stray during the solstice. Tainted goods, perhaps, but she has the sturdy hips of a breeder and a high pain tolerance. A cruel wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. In the front row, Thorn smirked, whispering something into her sister's ear that made the new Luna giggle behind her hand. Lyra felt a cold, hard stone of hatred settle in her chest. Thorn had beaten her, collared her, and thrown her away, because she refused to bow to his political manipulations, and because she bore the scent of the masked stranger she had met in the neutral woods during the solstice festival. "Opening bid at 500 silver coins," Silas shouted. Silence. The criminal syndicate bosses, rogue alphas, and flesh peddlers simply stared. No one wanted a disgraced, impure female whose wolf was suppressed. The silence stretched, humiliating and heavy. Silas wiped sweat from his brow, lowering the price. 300. Come now. She can scrub floors or warm a bed. Before Silas could finish his sentence, the atmosphere in the room violently imploded. It wasn't a sound. It was a terrifying, instantaneous drop in barometric pressure. The flickering oil lamps lining the cavern walls simultaneously snuffed out, plunging the edges of the room into absolute darkness. The air grew paralyzingly cold. Then came the scent. It hit Lyra's senses like a physical shockwave, a violent blizzard tearing through an ancient dark pine forest, laced with the electric metallic crackle of pure ozone. It was a scent that demanded total, unquestioning submission. The alpha aura rolled into the room with the crushing weight of a collapsing mountain. All around the auction floor, hardened criminals and rogue alphas began to drop to their knees, clutching their throats as the oxygen was forcefully pushed out of their lungs. Even Thorn, the arrogant alpha of Blood Moon, buckled, his knees hitting the stone floor with a sickening crack. Lyra gasped, her chest heaving against the invisible pressure. Deep within her womb, a sudden, impossible warmth flared. The life inside her reacted to that scent. Her heart slammed against her ribs. It's him. The stranger from the solstice. The massive iron doors at the north entrance didn't just open. They were ripped off their reinforced steel hinges, crashing to the floor with a deafening boom. Through the dust and splintered metal strode Kalen, the Alpha King of the Northern Wests, known to the continent as the Butcher. He was a towering, imposing figure cloaked in midnight leather and furs, his eyes burning with a lethal, predatory gold. His gaze swept the room with absolute disdain, until his eyes snapped to the stage. He saw the rough planks. He saw the bruises blooming on Lyra's bare shoulder. He saw the heavy silver chains binding her wrists and the cruel collar biting into her neck. The temperature in the room dropped below freezing. Frost began to literally crystallize on the auctioneer's wooden podium. Kalen didn't raise his voice, but the low, guttural vibration of his words rattled the bones of every wolf in the room. 10 million gold imperials, the king commanded, his voice a blade drawn in the dark. Silas, trembling so violently he dropped his gavel, fell backward onto the stage. "Meh, my king, for the damaged Omega." Kalen moved faster than the eye could track. In a blur of motion, he was on the stage. He didn't use a weapon. He simply grabbed the thick silver chain binding Lyra to the floorbolt, and with a terrifying display of raw physical strength, ripped the steel bolt straight out of the wooden floorboards. He knelt before Lyra, his massive frame shielding her from the entire room. The sheer proximity of his aura was intoxicating, fighting back the lethargy of the silver in her veins. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering inches from her cheek, as if afraid his touch might break her. "You are not damaged," Kalen whispered. The words meant only for her, the scent of pine and ozone wrapping around her like a protective vault. The golden fire in his eyes softened as the ultimate realization. The snap of the fated mate bond locked their souls together. Before Lyra could speak, before she could warn him of the poison in her blood or the secret she carried, a harsh, metallic shing echoed through the silent hall. Thorn had managed to stand. He drew a silver-coated broadsword, his hand shaking, his pride overriding his survival instinct. "She is Blood Moon property, Your Majesty," Thorn spat, leveling the blade at the king's back. "And no one, not even you, takes what is mine." The silver-coated broadsword sang as it cut through the stagnant air, aimed directly at the space between Kalen's broad shoulders. Lyra's mind processed the geometry of the strike in a fraction of a second. Her hands were locked behind her back, her shoulders screaming in protest from the awkward angle, and the silver coursing through her veins made her muscles feel like lead. She could not push Kalen out of the way. She could not grab a weapon. But her legs were unbound, and her tactical intellect remained dangerously sharp. Dropping her center of gravity, Lyra pivoted on her right heel and drove her left boot violently into the heavy oak auctioneer's podium beside her. The solid wood structure tipped, crashing directly into Thorn's path. It didn't stop the Blood Moon Alpha, but it forced him to stutter step, his boot catching on the splintering wood. His swing went wide by exactly 2 inches. It was a window of time the Alpha King did not waste. Kalen didn't even turn around fully. He simply reached back, his massive, leather-clad hand snapping with terrifying precision to catch Thorn by the wrist. The impact sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Thorn gasped, his eyes going wide as his forward momentum was instantly, immovably halted. "You speak of property to a king." Kalen's voice was a low, glacial rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. With a brutal, calculated twist, Kalen snapped Thorn's wrist. The crack of bone was loud as a gunshot in the silent cavern. The silver sword clattered to the planks. Before Thorn could even scream, Kalen backhanded him across the jaw. The blow lifted the Alpha of the Blood Moon Pack entirely off his feet, sending him crashing into the front row of wooden chairs in a tangle of broken wood and bruised ego. Kalen turned his golden, predatory gaze to the rest of the room. The scent of ozone and winter storms spiked so sharply it tasted like copper on Lyra's tongue. The Alpha aura slammed down on the crowd, an invisible, crushing gravitational force. Several rogue mercenaries who had dared to reach for their weapons instantly dropped to their knees, blood dripping from their noses from the sheer atmospheric pressure. "She is no one's property," Kalen stated, his voice echoing off the damp cavern walls. "She is my mate, and she is under the protection of the Northern Crown. If any man in this room wishes to dispute this claim, stand now and die." Silence, absolute and terrified, was his only answer. Thorn, bleeding from the mouth and clutching his shattered wrist, did not rise. Kalen turned back to Lyra. The lethal, freezing gold in his eyes instantly melted into a pool of warm, liquid amber as he looked at her. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the grime of the auction block. "You warned me," he murmured, his voice softening to a timbre that sent a shiver down Lyra's spine, entirely separate from the cold. "You were in my way," Lyra rasped. Her throat felt as though it had been shredded by glass. The adrenaline from kicking the podium was evaporating, leaving behind a crashing wave of agony. The silver poisoning was advancing, her vision blurred at the edges, tunneling into darkness. Kalen's expression darkened as he saw the sickly, pale gray webbing spreading beneath the skin of her neck, the undeniable hallmark of heavy metal toxicity. He reached for the thick silver collar biting into her throat. As his bare fingers brushed the metal, a faint sizzle echoed, and Kalen hissed, pulling his hand back. Even to an Alpha King, pure, unalloyed silver was caustic. Lyra's analytical mind noted his wince. He feels pain. He is not invincible. Kalen inspected the collar's lock. Double-forged casing. If I try to pry it open with raw strength, the internal spikes will compress and crush your trachea. He analyzed aloud, his jaw ticking with barely restrained fury. He didn't offer empty platitudes or magical promises. He looked at the chains binding her wrists. "I cannot free your hands without risking a shoulder dislocation while you are standing. We need a dwarven smith and a pack healer. Now." From the shadows of the shattered iron doors, a tall, slender male with silver hair and calculating green eyes stepped forward. He wore the dark leathers of the Northern Guard. "Vane!" Kalen barked, not looking away from Lyra. "My king," the man replied, his voice smooth and detached. Vane stepped over Thorn's groaning body and casually tossed a heavy velvet pouch onto the chest of the cowering auctioneer, Silas. The pouch burst open, spilling glittering gold imperials. 10 million, paid in full. The crown honors its debts, even to scum. Kalen shifted his stance. "I am going to lift you," he told Lyra, his tone asking for permission, not commanding it. "I will support your forearms so the chains do not tear your rotator cuffs. Lean your head against my chest to take the weight off your neck." Lyra hesitated, every instinct drilled into her by Thorn, and the Blood Moon Pack screamed that alphas were controlling, violent, and manipulative. But the deep instinctual pull of the fated mate bond hummed beneath the agony of the silver, wrapping around her soul like a warm, protective blanket. She had roughly 47 hours left before kidney failure. She had a secret life growing in her womb. She couldn't walk out of here alone. Lyra gave a single tight nod. Kalen moved with surprising gentleness for a man of his size. He slid one massive arm under her knees and the other around her waist, his hand carefully supporting her bound wrists against the small of her back to alleviate the tension on her shoulders. As he lifted her, Lyra instinctively pressed her cheek against the smooth, cold leather of his armor. His scent, wild pine and crackling lightning, flooded her senses, pushing back the rotting smell of the auction house. He carried her out of the cavern, striding through the parted sea of terrified criminals. The winter air outside hit Lyra like a physical blow. The auction house was hidden beneath the sprawling ruins of an ancient fortress, and outside, a heavy armored carriage forged of black iron and drawn by 4 massive dire wolves waited in the snow. Kalen climbed into the carriage, refusing to hand her off to his guards. The interior was lined with thick, charcoal-colored furs that radiated warmth. He settled her onto the widest bench, keeping her carefully positioned on her side, so her bound wrists wouldn't be crushed beneath her own weight. As the carriage lurched forward, the rhythmic swaying sent a spike of nausea through Lyra's abdomen. She curled inward slightly, her instincts flaring. She had to protect her core. The heavy scent of blood, silver, and damp earth still clung to her, masking the faint secondary heartbeat inside her. But she knew an Alpha King's senses were unparalleled. If he found out she was carrying a child that wasn't his, a child from a faceless stranger in the woods, what would he do? Would he cast her aside just as Thorn had? Kalen reached out, pulling a thick wolf pelt over her shivering form. Rest, little wolf. The poison will try to pull you under. Let it. I have you. Lyra stared at his golden eyes, her own ice-blue gaze guarded and sharp. I am not yours, she wanted to say. I belong to no one. But the silver had finally breached her central nervous system. The world tilted violently on its axis, and Lyra surrendered to the encroaching dark, taking her secrets with her into the abyss. Consciousness did not return all at once. It clawed its way through a suffocating mire of agony. The first thing Lyra registered was the complete absence of the crushing weight around her throat. The heavy silver collar was gone. In its place, a thick, cooling poultice was slathered over her raw skin. The sharp, earthy scent of crushed moonflower root and eucalyptus filled the room, overpowering the metallic stench of her own poisoned blood. Lyra tried to swallow, and a flare of white-hot pain lanced down her esophagus. She choked, a dry, rattling cough tearing from her lips. Do not swallow aggressively, little wolf. The silver burned the dermal layers of your throat. The voice was older, feminine, and carried the rough cadence of the northern wastes. Lyra's eyes snapped open. Her vision swam before focusing on a domed stone ceiling illuminated by the dancing light of a massive hearth. She attempted to push herself up, but her wrists, thickly wrapped in heavy linen bandages, were stiff and useless. The muscles in her forearms trembled violently, lacking the strength to bear her weight. The silver had been removed, but the heavy metal toxicity had ravaged her nervous system. Stay still, the woman commanded gently. She was an elder, her silver hair braided tightly against her scalp, her hands stained green from herbal resins. She held a clay cup to Lyra's lips. Drink. It is a suspension of alkaline clay, charcoal, and moonflower extract. It will bind the remaining silver in your bloodstream and flush it through your kidneys. It tastes like wet ash, but it will save your life." Lyra's tactical mind immediately assessed the room. No guards, no chains, just the healer. She parted her cracked lips and allowed the elder to tip the thick, chalky liquid into her mouth. It was foul, but as it coated her throat, the burning sensation dulled to a manageable ache. As the healer pulled the cup away, Lyra's left hand twitched, instinctively falling toward her lower abdomen. The elder's sharp green eyes tracked the movement. She set the cup down on a bedside table with a quiet clack. "The pup survived," the healer murmured, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The heavy metals forced your body into a state of deep physiological hibernation to protect your core. It saved the pregnancy." Lyra's heart slammed against her bruised ribs. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of the medicine. She struggled to sit up, ignoring the agonizing protest of her torn shoulder ligaments. "Who else?" Lyra rasped, her voice sounding like grinding stones. "No one," the elder replied calmly, pressing a gentle but firm hand to Lyra's good shoulder, forcing her back down into the furs. "I am Alara, the High Healer of the Obsidian Keep. I stripped the silver from you myself while you were unconscious." The king stood guard outside the door. "He knows you are severely poisoned." "He does not know about the child." Lyra stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. "Alphas can smell a pregnancy." "Not through this," Alara said, tapping the thick poultice on Lyra's neck. "Moonflower root is highly astringent. Its scent is pungent enough to blind even a king's nose to subtle hormonal shifts. As long as you require the poultice, your scent is masked. But little wolf, you are the king's fated mate. You cannot hide this forever." "I am a refugee," Lyra corrected bitterly. "If Galen discovers I'm carrying another man's child, a nameless stranger's child, he will see it as a threat to his bloodline. Alphas do not raise pups that are not their own." "Our king is not Thorn," Alara said quietly. But before she could elaborate, the heavy oak door to the chamber clicked open. Instantly, the barometric pressure in the room shifted. It didn't slam down with the violent, crushing force of the auction house. Instead, it rolled in like a heavy, protective winter fog. The scent of wild pine and crackling lightning swept away the medicinal odors of the room. Galen stepped inside. He had shed his battle armor. He wore simple, dark woolen trousers and a charcoal tunic left unlaced at the throat, revealing the corded muscle of his chest. He looked exhausted, shadows bruising the skin beneath his golden eyes. He stopped 10 feet from the bed, deliberately keeping his distance to avoid overwhelming her fragile state with his aura. "You are awake," Galen said, his low, rumbling voice carefully modulated. He looked at Alara. "Status?" "The alkaline flush is working, my king," Alara reported, bowing her head. "But her motor functions are severely compromised. She will need weeks of rest before her wolf can even attempt to surface." "Leave us," Galen commanded softly. Alara bowed again and slipped out of the room, leaving the heavy oak door slightly ajar. A silent gesture from Galen to assure Lyra she was not trapped. Galen slowly approached the foot of the bed, his hands resting loosely on the footboard. He studied the bandages on her wrists, a muscle feathering in his square jaw. The dwarven smith had to cut the bolts piece by piece to avoid shattering your bones. "If I ever find the man who forged those cuffs, I will peel him." "Thorn commissioned them," Lyra rasped, pushing herself up against the headboard using her elbows, refusing to lie flat in the presence of an alpha. "He didn't just sell me for cruelty's sake, your majesty." Galen's golden eyes narrowed slightly at her formal tone. "Galen. My name is Galen to you, Lyra." She ignored the correction, her tactical intellect taking the wheel. She needed to prove she was an asset, not just a fragile, broken mate waiting to be cared for. Thorn is cunning. He sold me to the highest bidder to fund a mercenary army. He has formed an alliance with the Southern Syndicate. He intends to blockade the silver mines at the border. Kalen went perfectly still. The scent of ozone spiked sharply in the room. The Southern Syndicate operates exclusively in the shadows. How do you know this? Because before Thorn collared me, I was his tactical advisor, Lyra stated, her ice-blue eyes meeting his predatory gold without flinching. He relies on brute force, but I balanced his ledgers. I saw the encrypted missives. I know the patrol routes he traded to them. She paused, taking a shallow, agonizing breath. I will not be a pampered pet locked in a high tower, Kalen. I cannot fight with a sword right now, but I have my mind. Give me access to your maps. Let me earn my sanctuary. Kalen stared at her, an expression of profound, awestruck respect washing over his hardened features. He had expected a broken Omega needing comfort. Instead, he was looking at a battle-hardened strategist plotting a counter-offensive from a sickbed. You do not need to earn anything here, Kalen said, his voice dropping to a velvet hum that made Lyra's toes curl beneath the heavy furs. But if you wish to dismantle the pact that broke you, my war room is yours. He finally stepped closer, reaching out to gently brush a stray lock of raven hair from her damp forehead. His bare skin grazing hers sent a shockwave of electric warmth straight to her core. Lyra held her breath, terrified he would sense the secondary heartbeat fluttering within her. For now, the sharp, pungent scent of the moonflower root held the secret at bay. But as Kalen's golden eyes stared down at her with absolute, unwavering devotion, Lyra knew she was walking a razor's edge. She had found a king willing to go to war for her. But when the moonflower poultice came off, that same king might execute her. 10 days had passed since the auction, and gravity remained Lyra's most relentless enemy. The heavy metal toxicity had retreated from her major organs, thanks to Alara's grueling alkaline flushes, but the neurological damage lingered. She sat in a high-backed carved oak chair at the edge of the Obsidian Keep's central war room, a thick wool blanket draped over her lap to hide the uncontrollable tremors in her legs. Her left arm was bound in a sling, the shoulder ligaments still knitting together. She could not fight, but as she stared at the massive topographical map of the northern Wests spread across the ironwood table, her mind was a weapon running at peak efficiency. The atmosphere in the war room was stifling. 4 of Kalen's highest-ranking generals leaned over the map, their alpha auras clashing in a suffocating cloud of frustration. The room reeked of stale parchment, burning beeswax, and the aggressive, peppery musk of wolves ready for violence. Thorn is amassing his vanguard at the Silver Ridge Pass. General Torrin, a massive brute of a man with a scarred jaw, growled, slamming a wooden marker onto the map. He's flaunting his numbers. We take the heavy infantry, march down the gorge, and break his lines before the Southern Syndicate can reinforce him. A frontal assault into a choke point is statistical suicide, Torrin, Vane countered, his silver hair catching the firelight, his calculating green eyes unblinking. But if we allow him to hold the ridge, he cuts off our primary trade route to the eastern seaboard. At the head of the table, Kalen stood in total, unnerving silence. He wore a simple black tunic, his powerful arms crossed over his chest. His aura wasn't chaotic like his generals. It was a localized, crushing gravitational field. The scent of wild pine and crackling lightning blanketed the room, keeping the arguing alphas from tearing out each other's throats. Lyra watched Kalen's golden eyes track the wooden markers. He wasn't convinced by Torrin's plan, but he was waiting for someone to offer a better alternative. Lyra shifted in her chair. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, accompanied by a hollow ache in her lower abdomen. The pregnancy was demanding calories and energy her poisoned body barely had to spare. She casually reached up with her good hand, pressing a fresh patch of crushed moonflower root against the raw skin of her throat. The astringent, earthy scent bloomed, masking the subtle, sweet scent of wild honey and milk that had begun to lace her natural pheromones. "He isn't at the ridge," Lyra said. Her voice was still a raspy whisper, damaged by the silver collar, but in the cavernous, echoing chamber, it cut through the general's booming voices like a scalpel. 4 furious alpha gazes snapped to her. Torin bared his teeth. "This is a war council, Omega. You may share the king's bed, but you do not speak on matters of—" The air pressure in the room violently imploded. Torin choked, his hands flying to his throat as Kalen's aura slammed down on him with the weight of a collapsing glacier. "She is your queen," Kalen rumbled, his voice a glacial warning that rattled the iron chandeliers. "And she speaks whenever she wishes. Finish your thought, Lyra." The room was paralyzed by the king's display of dominance, but Lyra ignored the suffocating pressure. She kept her ice-blue eyes fixed on the map. "Thorn is a narcissist, but he is not a fool," Lyra explained, leaning forward, the effort sending a spike of agony through her ribs. "He knows your heavy infantry would slaughter his vanguard in a head-on collision. The forces at the Silver Ridge Pass are a decoy, a noisy, expensive distraction." Vane raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued. "Then, where is his main host?" "Underneath us," Lyra replied flatly. "When I balanced the Blood Moon ledgers, Thorn purchased massive quantities of deep earth excavation charges from the Southern Syndicate. He isn't planning to march over the mountains. He's using the old dwarven smuggling routes, the same subterranean network they used to move me to the auction house." She reached out with her trembling right hand, attempting to grasp a charcoal pencil to draw the route. Her fingers spasmed, the weakened nerves failing her, and the pencil clattered against the wood. A flush of deep humiliation burned her cheeks. She hated being weak. Before the pencil could roll off the table, Kalen was there. He had crossed the room with predatory silence. He didn't offer pity. Instead, he stood directly behind her chair. He leaned down, his massive, heat-radiating chest brushing against her uninjured shoulder. He picked up the charcoal and gently wrapped his large, calloused hand over her trembling, ice-cold fingers, stabilizing her grip. "Show me," Kalen murmured, his voice a low, velvet hum right beside her ear. The scent of ozone and pine enveloped her so completely that Lyra's breath hitched. The faded mate bond, usually a quiet hum, roared to life at the intimate contact, sending a shocking jolt of warmth straight to her core. Guided by Kalen's steady hand, Lyra drew a thick black line across the map, tracing a hidden fault line that bypassed the mountains entirely. "Here." The tunnels led out at the sunken quarry, less than 3 miles from the keep's southern flank. "If you send the army to the ridge, you leave the keep undefended. He will breach the walls from below." The generals stared at the map in stunned, horrified realization. The tactical brilliance of the trap was undeniable. Kalen squeezed her hand gently, a silent surge of profound pride radiating from him. But as he remained bent over her, his face inches from the crook of her neck, his golden eyes narrowed. The heat of his body was causing the moonflower poultice to dry out faster than usual. Kalen inhaled slowly. Beneath the sharp, medicinal sting of the eucalyptus, his alpha senses caught a microfraction of a scent that did not belong to a recovering victim. It was the rich, undeniable biological marker of new life. Kalen stiffened. The muscles in his forearms turned to iron. "Lyra," he whispered, confusion and a dark, dangerous possessiveness bleeding into his tone. "What is that scent?" Panic, cold and absolute, seized Lyra's heart. She tried to pull away, but before she could formulate a lie, the heavy oak doors of the war room smashed open. A perimeter scout collapsed onto the stone floor, his leather armor shredded, his breath rattling with fluid. "My king," the scout gasped, coughing up dark blood. "The quarry. They breached the southern quarry. But it isn't just mercenaries. The syndicate. They armed them with silver dust explosives. The air is toxic. We are losing the perimeter." The blood drained from Vane's face. Silver dust. If that breaches the keep's ventilation, it will slaughter every wolf inside. Lyra's tactical mind short-circuited as a violent, agonizing cramp ripped through her lower abdomen. The sheer terror of the silver, the very poison she had just barely survived, returning to suffocate the life growing inside her, was too much for her fragile system. She gasped, her good hand flying to her stomach as she slumped heavily against Kalen's chest, her terrifying secret hovering on the razor's edge of discovery. The agonizing cramp in Lyra's lower abdomen seized her entire core, a violent biological imperative screaming at her to protect the fragile life within. As her knees buckled, Kalen caught her before she could strike the stone floor, his massive arms wrapped around her, pulling her tightly against the solid, heat-radiating wall of his chest. "Lyra!" Kalen's voice was a devastating roar, vibrating with a panic that cracked the stoic facade of the Alpha King. The war room had erupted into chaos. The dying scout on the floor exhaled a final, rattling breath, and as he did, a faint, glittering cloud of gray dust plumed from his shredded leather armor. The scent hit the air instantly, acrid, metallic, and utterly lethal. General Torin roared, drawing a massive broadsword that scraped loudly against its iron scabbard. "They want to gas us out. Vane, rally the vanguard. We march into the quarry and slaughter them before the dust breaches the upper levels." "No," Lyra gasped. The single word tore at her healing throat, tasting of copper and ash. She writhed against the blinding pain in her stomach, her left arm useless in its sling, her right hand clutching Kalen's tunic. Kalen instantly raised a hand, his golden eyes flashing with lethal authority, freezing his generals in their tracks. He didn't look at them. His gaze was entirely locked on Lyra's pale, sweat-slicked face. The scent of ozone and crackling lightning surged from him, forming a localized high-pressure dome around them that physically pushed the creeping silver dust away from Lyra's face. "Speak, my queen," Kalen commanded softly, ignoring the dying scout and the impending siege. Lyra forced her tactical mind to override her physical agony. She drew a shallow, ragged breath, visualizing the architectural schematics of the obsidian keep she had been studying for the past hour. "It's a trap, Torin," she rasped, her ice-blue eyes locking onto the scarred general. "Thorn is heavily outmatched in hand-to-hand combat. He flooded the quarry with silver dust precisely to force your vanguard into a choke point. If you charge down there, you will breathe the dust. It will neutralize your healing factors. You will drown in your own blood before you swing a sword." Vane, the calculating strategist, went completely still. She is right. It's an execution chamber. But if we do not engage, the ventilation drafts will pull the silver up into the keep. It will kill the elders and the pups in the lower wards within the hour. "Dwarven engineering," Lyra ground out, her fingernails biting into Kalen's chest as another, milder cramp rippled through her. The keep. It wasn't built to pull air up. It was a forge. It uses pressure differentials to vent smoke down and out into the mountain fissures. The natural draft is reversed right now, because the hearths are unlit. Kalen's brilliant, tactical mind caught her meaning instantly. His eyes widened. "Vane," Kalen barked, his voice echoing with absolute command. "Take the engineering core to the subterranean furnace rooms. Ignite the primary forge fires, all of them. burn the coal reserves to ash. Vane's green eyes lit up with predatory realization. The heat will reverse the barometric pressure in the shafts. It won't pull the silver into the keep. It will forcefully blow it back down into the sunken quarry. We gas them with their own weapon, Torin growled, a vicious, feral grin splitting his face. He bowed deeply to Lyra, a gesture of profound, undeniable respect from an alpha to a bruised omega. Brilliant, my queen. Go, Kaelin roared. The generals sprinted from the room, their heavy boots thundering down the stone corridors. Alone in the war room with the king and the dead scout, Lyra finally let her head fall back against Kaelin's shoulder. The immediate threat to the keep was handled, but her own internal war was rapidly unwinding. The physical exertion of shouting, combined with the sheer terror of the silver dust, had pushed her recovering body past its breaking point. Kaelin didn't waste a second. He swept her completely into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. He moved with terrifying speed, striding out of the war room and bypassing the main corridors, taking a hidden spiral staircase meant for the royal guard. He was taking her directly to the High Healer's isolated ward. Hold on, little wolf, Kaelin murmured, his jaw tight. Ilara will give you the alkaline draft. I have you. But as he carried her up the steep, narrow steps, the frantic movement took its toll. The thick wool collar of Kaelin's tunic rubbed aggressively against Lyra's throat. The movement caught the edge of the crushed moonflower poultice. With a soft, damp sound, the herbal patch peeled away from her healing skin, falling away into the darkness of the stairwell. Instantly, the sharp, astringent scent of eucalyptus vanished. Lyra's breath hitched in absolute terror. She tried to press her own hand to her neck to cover the scent glands, but her arm was pinned awkwardly against his chest. In the enclosed, suffocating space of the stairwell, Kaelin stopped dead. His boots halted on the stone. The heavy, protective aura of ozone and pine suddenly shifted, growing dangerously still. The Alpha King inhaled. Without the moonflower to mask it, the scent of the fated mate bond was intoxicating. But beneath it, undeniable and pure, was the biological marker of a pregnant female. The rich, sweet scent of wild honey, milk, and cellular division flooded Kaelin's heightened alpha senses. Slowly, agonizingly, Kaelin looked down at her. The golden fire in his eyes had fractured, replaced by a storm of confusion, betrayal, and a possessive, territorial fury that made the air in the stairwell physically heavy. He looked from her terrified ice-blue eyes down to where her good hand was instinctively, desperately cradling her lower abdomen. "Lyra," Kaelin whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, contained violence. "Who is the father?" The silence in the narrow stone stairwell was absolute, save for the ragged, shallow pants tearing from Lyra's throat. Kaelin's alpha aura, usually a protective, grounding weight, had fractured. It swirled around them in a violent, chaotic tempest of cracking ozone and freezing winter squalls. Frost physically began to form on the damp stone walls of the hidden passage. His golden eyes, moments ago warm with devotion, were now wide, feral rings of pure territorial violence. "Who?" Kaelin repeated, the single syllable vibrating with enough low-frequency power to rattle the iron sconces. The veins in his neck were corded steel. Lyra's analytical mind demanded she lie, to protect the fragile life inside her from an alpha's wrath. But she knew the biological truth was impossible to hide now. The sharp scent of moonflower was gone. Her natural pheromones, laced heavily with the sweet, rich scent of wild honey and cellular division, were entirely exposed. Instead of shrinking away, Lyra forced her chin up. She ignored the burning in her injured shoulder and met the Alpha King's lethal gaze directly. She would not die cowering. "I don't know his name," she rasped, her voice trembling but her ice-blue eyes defiant. It was the night of the winter solstice, in the neutral zone of the Ashen Weald. Kalen's breathing hitched. The microscopic shift in his massive chest was the only crack in his statuesque fury. Lyra swallowed hard, tasting copper. Thorn had banished me to the outer perimeter of the festival to guard the supply wagons. He forbade me from wearing the pack colors. I was alone in the freezing rain, and I found a rogue, a male wearing a heavily charmed iron mesh mask to obscure his identity and scent. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, the memory washing over her. He had been ambushed. His side was torn open by silver-laced blades. He was bleeding out in the mud. I dragged him into a hollowed-out rootwood tree. I packed his wounds with river moss and mud to draw out the poison. And then, Kalen whispered. The violent tempest of ozone in the stairwell suddenly stopped churning. The air grew unnervingly still. The blood loss triggered his survival instincts. He went into a state of feral frenzy, and the terror of the silver. Lyra's breath caught, a hot tear slipping down her pale cheek despite her iron control. It triggered a stress heat in me. We were trapped in the dark. It wasn't planned. It was biological survival. Before dawn, before the rain washed the mud away and revealed his scent, he was gone. And a month later, Thorn realized I was pregnant with a bastard, stripped me of my rank and sold me. She braced herself, waiting for Kalen to drop her. She expected the disgust. She expected him to abandon her on the freezing stone steps. Alphas of his pedigree did not raise the nameless bastards of rogues. But Kalen didn't drop her. Instead, the massive Alpha King slowly sank to his knees on the steep staircase, carefully keeping Lyra cradled against his chest so her bound arm and healing ribs wouldn't shift. The feral gold in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a devastating, world-shattering shock. A hollowed-out rootwood tree, Kalen murmured, his voice entirely hollow. He looked down at his own right side, where beneath his leather armor rested a massive, jagged scar that had nearly claimed his life 2 months prior. Lyra frowned, confusion cutting through her terror. What? The assassins were sent by the Southern Syndicate, Kalen breathed, his eyes locking onto hers, tracing the curve of her jaw, the shape of her lips, as if seeing her for the first time. They coated their blades in liquid silver. I masked my scent with a charmed iron helm so they couldn't track my bloodline. I collapsed in the Weald. I woke up hours later, my wounds packed with river moss, smelling of rain and the sweetest, most desperate heat I had ever encountered. Lyra's heart stopped. The mathematical impossibility of it crashed through her tactical mind. The size of the stranger in the dark. The sheer, overwhelming dominance of his touch. The way her body had instantly surrendered. A reaction she had blamed on her stress heat. It hadn't been a rogue. The snap of the fated mate bond at the auction house hadn't been their first meeting. You... Lyra gasped, her hand instinctively clutching his tunic. You were the male in the mud. It is my pup, Kalen choked out. The Alpha King, the butcher of the northern wastes, buried his face into the crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet scent of wild honey and milk. A low, rumbling purr of absolute instinctual possession vibrated from his chest, shaking them both. You saved my life, Lyra, and you are carrying my heir. Before Lyra could even begin to process the monumental revelation, a violent, agonizing spasm ripped through her abdomen. The adrenaline crash from the war room combined with the emotional shock and the lingering heavy metal toxicity finally broke her body's fragile equilibrium. She cried out, her back arching in pain as a terrifying wet warmth bloomed between her thighs. Lyra! Kalen's head snapped up, the purr instantly transforming into a roar of panic. "The pub," she sobbed, terror completely overriding her composure. "Kaylin, something is wrong. The silver, it's in my blood." He didn't say another word. Kaylin shot to his feet, holding her flush against his racing heart, and took the remaining stairs 3 at a time. He burst through the heavy oak doors of the high healer's isolated ward, nearly tearing them off their hinges. "Elara!" Kaylin bellowed, his voice vibrating with enough sheer panic to wake the dead. The elderly healer rushed out from her apothecary room, her hands already glowing with a faint, green restorative energy. She took one look at Lyra's pale face and the scent of distress radiating from the king. "Put her on the table, my king," Elara ordered, stripping away titles in the face of a medical emergency. "Now." Kaylin gently laid Lyra onto the padded examination table. Elara immediately went to work, pressing her glowing hands over Lyra's lower abdomen. Suddenly, the doors to the ward slammed open again. Vane sprinted into the room, his usually pristine silver hair disheveled, his green eyes wide with urgency. "The furnace trick worked, my king. The quarry is clear," Vane reported breathlessly. But his tone was entirely devoid of victory. He held up a blood-stained piece of parchment bearing the wax seal of the Continental High Council. Kaylin didn't look away from Lyra. "What is it, Vane?" "Thorne survived the backdraft," Vane said grimly. "And he realized he cannot beat you with force. He has filed a formal petition with the High Council. He claims you violated the ancient accords by stealing a condemned Omega from his sovereign territory." Lyra groaned on the table, her mind fighting through the pain. "The accords. They dictate that a Pack Alpha has ultimate jurisdiction over their criminals." "Exactly," Vane said, his voice tight. "The High Council is marching on the keep. They arrive by dawn. Thorne is demanding your execution for an act of war, or the immediate return of his property." Kaylin slowly stood up from the table. The warmth of the father vanished, replaced entirely by the chilling, lethal aura of the Alpha King. He looked at Vane, his golden eyes burning like twin suns. "Let them come," Kaylin said softly. "They want to claim my mate. They will find a war." The High Healer's ward smelled of copper, sterile alcohol, and the suffocating ozone-heavy terror radiating from the Alpha King. Lyra lay rigid on the examination table, her jaw locked in agony. The spasms in her abdomen were violent, tearing through her with the force of a serrated blade. The silver toxicity, agitated by the stress of the war room and the emotional shock of Kaylin's revelation, was mounting a final, lethal assault on her internal organs. "Her kidneys are failing to filter the heavy metals," Elara shouted over Lyra's strained gasps. The elderly healer was moving with frantic precision, snapping a thick, hollowed-out glass reed into a leather tube. "The alkaline flush isn't enough. The silver is attacking the placenta to get to the pup. If we don't dilute her blood volume immediately, she will hemorrhage." "Do it," Kaylin commanded. He had stripped off his leather armor. His massive chest heaved, his golden eyes fixed on Lyra's pale, sweat-drenched face. "Take my blood." "Your Majesty, direct transfusion of poisoned blood will transfer the silver into your own vascular system." "I am an Alpha King," Kaylin roared, the sheer gravitational force of his aura rattling the glass vials on the apothecary shelves. "My liver can process the toxicity. Hers cannot. Do it now, Elara." Lyra tried to shake her head, her weak, trembling left hand reaching for him. "Kaylin. No. The war. There is no war without you," he murmured fiercely. He stepped to the edge of the table, offering his thick forearm to the healer. Elara didn't waste another second. With ruthless efficiency, she punctured Kalen's vein with a silver-tipped needle attached to the leather tubing, then drove the other end into the crook of Lyra's uninjured arm. The biological transfer was instantaneous and agonizing. As Kalen's rich, highly oxygenated alpha blood flooded Lyra's collapsing system, the heavy metal toxicity was siphoned back out into him. Kalen staggered, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth as the burning silver hit his bloodstream. The veins in his neck bulged, turning a sickly dark gray, but he did not fall. He locked his jaw, his golden eyes burning with absolute protective defiance as he held Lyra's trembling hand. Slowly, agonizingly, the excruciating cramps in Lyra's core began to subside. The sweet, rich scent of wild honey and cellular division stabilized in the air, no longer undercut by the sour stench of distress. "The pup is secure." Ilara breathed a heavy sigh of relief, quickly clamping the tubing and applying pressure bandages to both of their arms. "But she cannot walk, my king. Her nervous system is completely depleted. She requires absolute bed rest." Before Kalen could reply, a deep, resonant horn blasted through the freezing dawn air. The sound vibrated through the stone walls of the keep, a long, continuous note of judgment. The Continental High Council had arrived. Vane appeared in the doorway seconds later, his usually stoic expression grim. 3,000 elite sentinels, my king. They have surrounded the keep. High Inquisitor Malachor is at the vanguard, flanked by Alpha Thorn. They have erected the tribunal pavilion at the gates. They demand your immediate presence to answer for the violation of the ancient accords. Kalen carefully released Lyra's hand. He turned his back to the table, and the tender, sacrificing father vanished. The butcher of the northern wastes returned, his aura shifting into a localized blizzard of lethal intent. "Rally the heavy infantry to the courtyard. If they try to breach the gates, we paint the snow red." "No!" Lyra rasped. Kalen stopped, glancing back at her. "Lyra, you are safe here. I will end Thorn myself. If you strike a High Inquisitor, the entire continent will unite against the North." Lyra forced herself to speak, her analytical mind cutting through the lingering haze of the medical procedure. 3,000 sentinels against your vanguard. It's a massacre. Thorn knows he can't beat you in combat. He weaponized the bureaucracy to let the council execute you for him. It's mathematically perfect. "Then what is your command, my queen?" Vane asked, stepping fully into the room, his green eyes deferential to her tactical intellect. "We do not fight the law with swords," Lyra said, her ice-blue eyes sharpening into twin daggers. She looked at Kalen. "We fight it with ledgers. I need my records. The encrypted ones I hid in the lining of my corset before Thorn sold me." Kalen frowned, the silver in his veins making his movements slightly rigid as he turned back to her. "You cannot face the council, Lyra. You cannot even stand." "Then you will carry me," Lyra demanded, her voice lacking volume but radiating absolute authority. "Thorn thinks I am a broken, disgraced Omega. He expects you to hide me like stolen property. If you leave me up here, his legal claim holds weight. But if I expose his treason against the Accords on his own terms..." A dark, feral grin slowly spread across Vane's face. "The burden of proof shifts." Kalen studied her pale face, seeing the unyielding iron in her eyes. He nodded slowly. "Vane, retrieve her corset from the armory, and bring the king's throne out to the battlements." 20 minutes later, the heavy iron portcullis of the obsidian keep remained shut, but the massive stone balcony overlooking the valley was occupied. The winter wind howled, whipping Kalen's black cloak around him as he stepped up to the battlements. In his arms, swathed in heavy, charcoal-colored direwolf pelts to hide her bandages and her trembling limbs, was Lyra. He did not let her walk. He set her gently into the massive, iron-wrought throne that had been hauled out to the balcony, standing immediately at her right shoulder, his hand resting possessively on the back of her chair. Down in the snow-swept valley, the spectacle was staggering. Thousands of heavily armored sentinels stood in perfect formation. At their head was a massive velvet-draped pavilion. High Inquisitor Malachor, a gaunt elder in crimson robes, stepped forward, his magically amplified voice booming across the gorge. "Alpha King Kalen," Malachor declared, "you stand accused of grand theft and violation of sovereign jurisdiction. You have stolen a condemned Omega, the rightful property of the Blood Moon Pack. Yield the female, or face execution by the united forces of the Continental Council." Beside the Inquisitor, Thorn stood tall, a smug, victorious sneer plastered across his face. His arm was heavily casted from Kalen's blow, playing the part of the aggrieved, assaulted leader perfectly. Lyra looked down at the man who had ordered her stripped, beaten, and sold. Her left hand gripped the armrest of the throne to steady her shaking body, while her right hand slipped beneath her heavy furs, her fingers curling around a small, crumpled stack of encrypted parchment. She took a slow, agonizing breath, preparing to tear Thorn's empire apart. The howling winter wind sweeping through the valley threatened to drown out the sheer, terrifying silence of the northern wastes. 3,000 elite sentinels stood motionless in the snow, their armor glinting under the pale dawn sun. "I demand the immediate surrender of the condemned Omega." High Inquisitor Malachor's magically amplified voice thundered again, rattling the iron portcullis of the keep. "Alpha King Kalen, your silence is an admission of guilt. By the ancient accords, you are harboring stolen property." On the balcony, Kalen did not flinch. His golden eyes were fixed on the Inquisitor, but he did not step forward to the stone railing. Instead, he stepped slightly back, yielding the vanguard to the heavy iron throne where Lyra sat, wrapped in dire wolf pelts. The scent of crackling ozone and wild pine surged from Kalen, rolling off the balcony and crashing into the valley like a localized avalanche. The crushing weight of the king's aura physically forced the front lines of the council's sentinels to stagger back a step. The message was clear, primal, and absolute. He answered to no one. They would speak to his queen. Lyra drew a sharp breath. The silver toxicity had left her lungs feeling like brittle parchment, but her mind was crystalline. "High Inquisitor Malachor," Lyra called out. She did not have a magical amplifier. Her voice was raspy and damaged from the silver collar, but Kalen, anticipating her physical limitation, placed his massive, calloused hand on the back of her iron throne. He pushed a concentrated pulse of his alpha aura directly into the stone, manipulating the barometric pressure in the canyon to carry her voice perfectly, a trick of atmospheric physics that echoed her words flawlessly across the gorge. Down in the snow, Thorn's smug expression faltered. He squinted up at the balcony, the scent of his sudden, acrid panic barely reaching the battlements. "Who addresses the tribunal?" Malachor demanded, leaning on his tall staff, his silver brows furrowing. "An Omega has no voice in the Continental Courts." "I am Lyra of the Northern Wastes," she stated, her ice-blue eyes piercing the distance. "And I am not an Omega. I am the fated mate of the Alpha King, and I claim the right of sovereign defense." A murmur rippled through the 3,000 sentinels. A fated mate was sacred, heavily protected by the very accords Malachor was here to enforce. Thorn stepped forward, his casted arm held tight to his chest. "She is a liar and a breeder of rogue bastards. She is poisoned and delusional. Malachor, they are stalling. Order the breach." "I claim sovereign defense," Lyra repeated, her voice cutting through Thorn's desperate shout like a scalpel. "The Blood Moon Pack invoked the Accords to claim me as property, but the Accords strictly state that any Alpha found guilty of high treason against the Continental Council forfeits all territorial and property rights. Malachor held up a hand, silencing Thorn. The Inquisitor was a creature of absolute law. Treason is a capital charge, female. The penalty for a false accusation is death. Lyra's trembling right hand emerged from beneath the heavy furs. Her fingers were stiff, her knuckles white, but she held the crumpled, blood-stained stack of encrypted parchment high. Before Alpha Thorn banished me to the auction block to silence me, I was his tactical advisor, Lyra said, her voice dripping with lethal precision. I balanced the Blood Moon ledgers. He did not sell me for cruelty. He sold me to fund the purchase of deep earth excavation explosives from the Southern Syndicate. Thorn's heartbeat spiked. The sound was audible in the quiet canyon, a frantic, rabbit-like thumping. The sour stench of pure terror erupted from him. Lies. She is holding blank paper. The Syndicate is a black market cartel, Lyra continued, ruthlessly talking over him. But they are meticulous accountants. The ledgers I hold contain the ciphered shipment manifests. They detail Thorn's purchase of silver dust weaponry, a banned substance under council law. Furthermore, the ledgers prove he traded the council's sovereign patrol routes to the Syndicate in exchange for mercenary reinforcements. The atmosphere in the valley violently shifted. The sentinels, previously rigidly facing the keep, subtly shifted their spears, the steel tips now angling slightly toward Thorn. "Vain," Lyra whispered, her energy waning rapidly. The Northern Guard commander materialized from the shadows of the battlements. He took the parchments from her trembling fingers. With a swift, fluid motion, Vane leaped from the 30-foot stone balcony, landing flawlessly in the deep snow below. He walked straight through the parting sea of sentinels and handed the papers directly to Malachor. Thorn lunged for them. "Do not read those. They are forged." Malachor slammed the butt of his staff into Thorn's chest, throwing the Alpha back into the snow. The Inquisitor unfolded the parchments. He pulled a small, glowing jeweler's loop from his crimson robes, a truth-seeker crystal, and pressed it to his eye. Silence stretched for 2 agonizing minutes. Only the wind howled. Lyra gripped the arms of the throne, her vision swimming slightly. Kaelin's hand tightened on the back of the chair, grounding her, his thumb brushing her shoulder through the furs in a silent promise of protection. Down below, Malachor lowered the crystal. His gaunt face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and profound fury. "The cipher matches the Syndicate's known algorithmic patterns," Malachor announced, his voice booming with lethal authority. "The Blood Moon seal is magically authenticated in the wax. The ledgers confirm the trade of Council military routes to a recognized enemy." Malachor turned slowly toward Thorn. The Inquisitor's aura, usually neutral, flared with the burning, oppressive heat of absolute justice. "Alpha Thorn," Malachor said coldly, "you have weaponized this tribunal to mask your own treason. You are stripped of your rank, your pack, and your life." Thorn scrambled backward in the snow, his eyes wild, feral, and cornered. "No, I am a sovereign Alpha. You cannot—" His survival instincts completely hijacked his logic. With a sickening crack of bone, Thorn shifted into a massive, rust-colored wolf, entirely disregarding his broken arm. He didn't lunge at the Inquisitor. He turned and bolted toward the tree line, intent on abandoning his pack and his pride to survive. "Stop him!" Malachor shouted. But the sentinels were too far away. On the balcony, Kaelin moved. He didn't draw a sword. He didn't shift. The Alpha King simply stepped to the edge of the stone railing, his golden eyes locking onto the fleeing rust-colored wolf. Kaelin inhaled deeply, the corded muscles in his chest expanding, and unleashed the full, unbridled, devastating force of his king's aura. It hit the valley floor like a physical meteor. The barometric pressure instantly crushed downward. The snow in a 50-yard radius around Thorn vaporized into mist. The rust-colored wolf was slammed violently into the frozen earth, pinned flat on his stomach, completely paralyzed by the sheer gravitational dominance of the true Alpha King. Thorn whined, blood dripping from his nose as his bones groaned under the atmospheric weight. Kalen looked down at Malachor. "The Northern Crown delivers your prisoner, Inquisitor. Execute the law." Malachor, deeply shaken by the display of godlike power, bowed deeply at the waist, entirely abandoning his previous arrogance. "The Council thanks the Crown, and we humbly beg the forgiveness of your Queen." At the word Queen, Lyra let out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the tactical maneuver finally crashed. The world tidaled dangerously, the gray edges of her vision completely taking over. But she didn't fall. Kalen was there, instantly scooping her out of the Iron Throne and pulling her flush against his chest, shielding her from the wind and the world. "It's over, little wolf," Kalen murmured against her hair, his violent aura vanishing, leaving only the warm, protective scent of wild pine. "You won." 6 weeks after the tribunal, the brutal grip of winter finally broke across the northern wastes. The first thaw brought the sound of rushing meltwater to the gorge beneath the obsidian keep, a steady, rhythmic roar of renewal. Inside the newly designated Queen's Solar, the scent of fresh parchment, dark ink, and blooming mountain heather filled the sunlit room. Lyra sat behind a massive ironwood desk, her raven hair braided elegantly back, revealing the fading silvery scar around her neck. The heavy metal toxicity had been entirely purged from her system, though the neurological damage left a lingering stiffness in her left shoulder when it rained, and a deep biological exhaustion that required her to sleep through the afternoons. She respected the physical limitations, pacing herself, but her mind had never been sharper. Spread before her were the seized financial records of the Blood Moon Pack and the dismantled Southern Syndicate. "If we reroute the eastern timber shipments through the Ashen Weald, we cut the transportation tax by 40%, Lyra murmured to herself, her right hand flying across the ledger with a charcoal pencil. "We starve out the remaining Syndicate loyalists by monopolizing the trade routes they need to survive." The heavy oak door pushed open with a soft click. The barometric pressure in the Solar didn't drop. Instead, it settled into a warm, grounding hum. The scent of wild pine and crisp, clean mountain air wrapped around her, instantly soothing the subtle ache in her lower back. Kalen stepped into the room. He wore a simple, unlaced tunic and dark trousers, his imposing frame moving with the silent grace of an apex predator at absolute peace. In his massive, calloused hand, he held a delicate porcelain cup steaming with a brew of crushed ginger and willow bark, Ilara's specific remedy for Lyra's pregnancy-induced nausea and lingering joint inflammation. He set the cup near her left hand, careful not to disturb her meticulous stacks of parchment. "You have been at this since dawn, my queen," Kalen rumbled, leaning his hip against the edge of the heavy desk. His golden eyes swept over the ledgers, burning with a mixture of profound devotion and raw, intellectual respect. "The High Council has already recognized your annexation of the Blood Moon territory. You don't need to mathematically conquer them. Tauren's vanguard is already holding their borders." Lyra picked up the teacup, letting the warmth soak into her stiff fingers. She took a slow sip, the sharp ginger settling her stomach. "Tauren is holding the borders with swords, Kalen," Lyra replied, her ice-blue eyes meeting his. "Swords cost gold to maintain. Swords incite rebellion. I am restructuring their economy so that their supply lines are entirely dependent on the northern wastes. Within 6 months, the Blood Moon citizens won't want to rebel, because for the first time in a decade, they will be prosperous. We don't conquer them. We employ them." Kalen let out a low, vibrating hum of approval. The sound rumbled deep in his chest, a pure, instinctual response to his mate's ruthless brilliance. Thorn was a fool to ever think he could leash you. Thorn is dead, Lyra stated, her voice devoid of emotion. The Inquisitor had executed Thorn on the ice the moment the ledgers were verified. It had been quick, brutal, and utterly legal. Lyra set the teacup down and slowly stood. The swell of her abdomen was now visible beneath the soft wool of her gray gown, the biological marker of the life they had forged in the dark of the Weald. As she stood, Kalen instantly reached out, his large hands settling on her waist to offer steady physical support, without treating her like glass. Lyra looked up at him, establishing the boundary she had been forming over the past 6 weeks. "I am not a prize you won at an auction, Kalen," she said softly but with unyielding iron in her tone. "And I am not just the mother of your heir. When the child is born, I will not be confined to the nurseries. I am the architect of this continent's new economy. We rule as equals, or I rule myself." Kalen didn't flinch at her demand. Instead, the golden fire in his eyes flared brighter. He didn't want a submissive Omega. He worshipped the sharp, brilliant sovereign standing before him. "You dismantled a High Council siege from a chair while suffering from heavy metal poisoning," Kalen murmured, his voice dropping to a velvet, reverent whisper. He stepped closer, pulling her flush against his solid chest, wrapping his aura around her like a protective vault. "I don't wish to own you, Lyra. I simply wish to stand beside you while you conquer the world." He ducked his head, pressing his lips to the fading scar on her neck, kissing the exact spot where the silver collar had once bitten into her skin. The touch sent a cascade of electric warmth straight to Lyra's core. The fated mate bond, no longer masked by fear or moonflower root, sang in perfect, harmonious resonance. The scent of wild honey and milk blended seamlessly with the wild pine and ozone, creating a new, undeniable atmospheric signature that belonged only to the northern wastes. Lyra let out a long, shuddering breath, her hands sliding up Kalen's chest to rest over his racing heart. For the first time in her life, the tactical algorithms in her mind quieted. She didn't have to plan an escape. She didn't have to calculate her survival. "The snow is melting," Lyra whispered, resting her head against his shoulder, looking out the massive glass window toward the vibrant green shoots breaking through the frost of the valley. Kalen's arms tightened around her and their unborn pup, a fortress of absolute safety. "It is," the Alpha King replied. "Our dawn is just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to the complete story of No One Wanted the Rejected Omega Girl at the auction until the Alpha King bought her. If you enjoyed this journey of tactical brilliance, undeniable romance, and high-stakes justice, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this audio novel with your fellow fantasy romance lovers. It helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more cinematic stories just like this one. I want to hear from you in the comments. Which of Lyra's tactical maneuvers was your absolute favorite? Was it figuring out the dwarven ventilation system to blow the silver dust back at the mercenaries? Or was it keeping those encrypted ledgers hidden until the perfect moment to legally destroy Thorn at the tribunal? Let me know down below. When architecting this story, my primary goal was to completely deconstruct the damsel in distress trope often found in Alpha-Omega dynamics. Lyra is physically compromised for 90% of the narrative, yet she is undeniably the most dangerous person in the room. By enforcing strict physical constraints, such as the brutal reality of silver poisoning and her inability to just magically heal, we forced Lyra to rely entirely on her intellect, logistical planning, and tactical agency.